Welcome, everybody. My name is Ana Campoverde, and I am the director of the Joseph A. Unanue Latino Institute. If you're not familiar with the Institute, one of our students is going to be dropping a link in the chat box, but the Institute essentially provides scholarships, cultural programming, and professional development to students across campus. So tonight, we welcome you to Café con Joe's Family, Faith, and Culture. And I'd love to thank some of our co-sponsors who were nice enough to get on with this event and help us advertise it. And a huge thank you to Stephanie Sonic from Campus Ministry, who also is a huge collaborator on this event. And without further ado, I would love to introduce Stephanie. But before you take over, Stephanie, I just want to remind everyone that during the event, we will be dropping some audience engagement questions. So we would love your feedback. Please blow up the chat if you can. We also encourage you to use your hand raise option in case you have some questions, especially during the Q&A, but feel free to ask as many questions as you want in the chat box. I promise we'll get to however many we can before the end of the session. So without further ado, happy to welcome Stephanie to tell us a little bit more about tonight and our guests.
Absolutely. Thanks, Anna. And again, it is a pleasure to be here with all of you. As Anna mentioned, my name is Stephanie Sonic, and I'm the coordinator of programming here at Campus Ministry at Seton Hall. And it's really a delight to see some familiar faces, but also a lot of new ones. Back when Anna and I were talking about a potential collaboration, we were really excited to bring a conversation about faith and culture and family into this space in the Unanue Institute. So happy to be here and really excited for our conversation. To get us started today, before we jump into a little bit of a testimony, I do want to give our panelists a chance to introduce themselves briefly. We're really blessed to have really distinguished and wonderful and faith-filled professionals with us tonight to help enlighten our time of conversation together. So I'd like to just give them the chance to introduce themselves. Why don't we start with Marisali? If you could just unmute yourself, mention just kind of like those brief intro facts to get us started.
Sure. Super excited to be here. So my name is Marisali Santiago. I am originally from Puerto Rico, tiny little island in the middle of the Caribbean. So my parents moved to Florida. So my youth and young adulthood was spent in Florida. And then by God's providence, we moved up to the Northeast and Jersey. And now we're in Philadelphia. So I've been involved in youth ministry since I was like 16 years old in leadership roles and whatnot. For the past 10 years, I was a youth minister at 2 distinct parishes in Jersey. I also received my master's in pastoral ministry from Immaculate Conception Seminary in Seton Hall. So very excited to be able to sort of give back in a way to a place that gave me so much. And so I worked at the Office for Ministry with Youth and Young Adults at the Archdiocese of Newark for 3.5 years, paid 3 years as a volunteer, and now I am the director of the brand new Office for Ministry with Youth and the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. So thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. Becky, can you introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be here with you all. My name is Rebecca Rubalcaba, Becky, and I'm the Assistant Director of Outreach at the University of Notre Dame in Campus Ministry. I've been at the university as one of the team of Campus Ministry for 5 years now. I started there as I finished my Master's of Divinity program there at the University of Notre Dame. I entered right into working in campus ministry right after that. I am from South Bend, Indiana, originally born and raised. And so Notre Dame, I grew up with Notre Dame in my backyard. And my parents, came up to the north here as migrant farm workers. So I'm a daughter of migrant farm workers and very proud of that. And I've been married for 24 years. It will be 25 years this August, and my husband is a deacon in our diocese here in Fort Wayne, South Bend. I'm so looking forward for this opportunity to be with you all here in really talking about this topic of culture and faith and the intersections of all that. I've worked a great deal with our Latino community on campus and also in my parish community here, which is a shared parish of Polish and Latino with Mexican heritage. So thank you for having me here today.
Excellent. We're happy to have you, Becky. And Leo, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. Well, thank you for the invitation, first of all. My name is Leo Guardado. I am originally from El Salvador, where I was born, grew up till I was about 10. And then there was a war going on, so my mom and I left. We migrated north and crossed without authorization, as they say, or illegally through Tijuana into LA. And I grew up in California till I went to college in the Bay Area. And then I've done grad school at Notre Dame, actually, both a master's and a doctoral program in theology and peace studies. I worked at the US-Mexico border with NGOs and parishes and dioceses, and my research has to do with sanctuary churches that provide sanctuary to persons fleeing for persecution from ICE. And so I am now a professor at Fordham University. So we're not far from each other. And here I teach courses on liberation theology, Latino, Latinx theology, mystical kind of texts of Christianity, among others. So thank you.
Excellent. Well, we're so glad to have you all. And in our conversations leading up to this point, it was really a blessing to hear from our three panelists some of their own experiences growing up in that intersection of faith and culture that is so often found in our Latino communities. And so we wanted to start off tonight's discussion with hearing a particular testimony from one of our own students in our own Seton Hall community. And so with that, I want to invite Claudia Romani to unmute herself, and she's going to start us off with a personal testimony of that grappling with faith and culture right here in New Jersey. So go ahead, Claudia.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you for this opportunity to share my testimony. This is actually, I think, the first time I'll be sharing my testimony in front of a group of people. I did it once at a poetry slam, but I did it in Spanish, so this time it'll be in English. Thank you, everyone. My name is Claudia. I am a junior at Seton Hall University. I'm double majoring in psychology and speech pathology. So a little bit about myself growing up. I grew up in a household, multi-generational home. So parents, grandparents, siblings. All my family members identified as Catholics, but no one really practiced the faith. So I was never really encouraged to go to Mass or follow any traditions. So that wasn't a thing that we did. But I do remember my grandma, she was very faithful. So she would take me to Spanish Mass in this little church in Patterson called St. Mary Help of Christians. And if you know anything about Spanish Mass, if you went to Spanish Mass before, it's basically a celebration. Everyone's dancing, everyone's clapping, everyone's singing. So it's a very nice memory of my childhood that I had growing up. And I just remember every time I stepped into church, I would see this big cross. And I'd feel like the smallest person in the world when I saw that cross growing up. And I just felt the sense of peace. And so growing up, I always knew that there was something, that I was desiring something more, a relationship with the Lord, but I just didn't know what it was. And I was never really encouraged to understand it. So then fast forward to high school, first time I'm entering a private Catholic high school. So this is the first time I'm really exploring my Catholic faith. I'm being taught the different teachings, and this is the first time I'm actually encouraged to build a relationship with the Lord. And so this time is one of the most happiest times of my life, but also one of the most confusing, because I knew I wanted a relationship, but there was this point where I hit that I wasn't doing enough or I wasn't just putting enough effort to build that relationship with the Lord. And so I tried to do 1,000,001 things. I joined choir, and I also started to go to daily morning Mass at my school. But then it got to a point where it felt like an obligation. So I was back at this point of I'm lost, but I desire more. So I stopped going to Mass at one point, and I stopped praying consistently because I just didn't feel like I was where I was supposed to be. So then I went to college and Seton Hall. The reason why I chose Seton Hall is because of the Catholic aspect. And I knew that here, I felt like I was going to find what I was looking for. Freshman year, still felt lost, still felt like I wanted more. And then comes this Empower retreat on fall 2019. Stephanie, I think we talked about this, like you invited me to go, I believe, when I was at one of the campus ministry events, and I've never been to a retreat before. But I thought that, well, why not? Let's try it out. And that was the first time I really experienced the presence of the Lord during adoration. I've never been to adoration before with music. That was the first time. I just felt this sense of peace. And I started crying because I've never felt that way before. And I was around other college students, people my age, who were also looking for that type of relationship. So for the first time, I didn't feel alone. I felt like, well, okay, other people want this too, just as much as I want it. So after the retreat, I remember I was just feeling all these good feelings. Yes, this is what I want. I'm finally feeling like I'm reaching that point where I'm in the best relationship with the Lord. But then there's always this, I'm not good enough. I'm not doing enough. I'm not praying enough. There's something else. So I remember asking one of my good friends, Millie, I asked her to go to Mass with me, and then we prayed after at the chapel at Seton Hall. And I was just asking the Lord, please, I need to have a better prayer life. I really need to build a relationship with you. And the craziest thing happened when I left the chapel. Random girl approached us and asked, do you want to join a Bible study? Out of nowhere. I don't even know who she was. She came out of nowhere. And I said, sure, I guess. Why not? That was something that was out of my comfort zone. And so I joined Bible study with, we were led by this one missionary called Tori, who actually was our discussion leader in the Empower retreat. And I was really inspired by everything she was doing. And so I joined Bible study, and this was, yet again, I was learning more about my faith and discovering who I wanted to be. And I realized this is home, being with the people, being with community who really encourages you and invests in you, because Tori and all of the other missionaries and people in campus ministry really invested in me. And I knew that God put these people in my life, and I don't believe in coincidences. I call them God incidences, because it's really God who's putting these people in my life. And then Tori, after Bible study, a semester of Bible study, approached me and asked if I wanted to join what we call discipleship. And that's basically, she wanted to form me into being a Bible study leader so that I could form my own Bible study group. And right now, this is I think my first year as a Bible study leader, and I'm leading other girls, and I'm investing in other girls. And I've just seen this wonderful transformation because I said yes to the Lord, yes to Bible study, yes to discipleship. And something that we've learned in discipleship is when you say yes, all you need is yes. God provides the rest. God will do the rest of the work. And that's something that I've learned, and something that I really bring into everything that I do is just saying yes and trusting in the Lord's plan, because his timing is perfect timing, right? I've prayed all this time since I was little that I wanted a better prayer life. It didn't happen when I wanted it. It happened when he wanted it. And that's just the plan, and that's how things work. Yeah, and it's not to say that now everything is rainbow and butterflies and everything's good. I still struggle, but I know that I don't do it alone. Jesus helps me carry my cross and helps me carry that burden. So for anyone in the panel who's maybe going through a similar journey, I just encourage you to trust and to know that you're not doing it alone, that there's someone there who's holding your hand, and you have this great community. And if you are interested in joining campus ministry, I'm just going to do shameless plug here. Campus ministry is awesome. It's a great community. And I've learned that it's important to invest in other people, because you create this chain reaction. You invest in one person, that person invests in another, and then more people, more souls that are being saved, more people that get to go to heaven. And that's the ultimate goal, I think. And I just wanted to end my testimony with one of my favorite quotes, and something that I hope you can take tonight. And that's from Jeremiah. For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope in a future. And that's what Jesus is telling us all today, that, just trust in him and trust in his plan. And that's what I did. And I couldn't be happier. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Claudia, for sharing that powerful story. And I really appreciate how you mentioned that you came from a nominal Catholic background, and over time, God's grace worked on you and came to you and was transformative. And that's kind of what we're here to explore today and hear from our panelists and examine that intersection of culture and faith and family. So now I want to turn the discussion towards Anna. And Anna, if you could highlight the results of our survey that we took with our students.
Absolutely. So, Claudia, thank you so much for your testimony. You're an incredible Latino Institute scholar, and we're really proud of everything that you do on campus. So for anyone, you might have, if you registered for this event, you definitely received the survey. So we wanted to take almost like a temperature check to see how our audience and our registrants were feeling, leading up to this event. And if you did participate in the survey, thank you so much, because we had a very large number of registrants actually complete the survey. So going through some of the questions, about 88% of the respondents grew up with religious affiliations that are here with us today. 64% grew up Catholic, 17% grew up Christian, and 20% grew up with Protestant or non-denomination. What was interesting for Stephanie and I, when we were reviewing the results of the survey, was about 64% of the audience or of the survey respondents noticed that there is a little bit of a disconnect between their family's religious practices and their own ideas. And then 58% feel that they have trouble balancing familial expectations and cultural expectations versus their own ideals. Of those, 17% don't really know how to overcome those challenges or really even start talking about those challenges. And then 60% of our respondents were first generation students. So I think, that's going to be a key focus of our discussion today with our amazing panelists. I know that, if you took part in the survey, thank you so much. And we're going to be talking about what happens when culture, family, and faith intersect, and what those perhaps sometimes dueling, sometimes inline identities kind of take over. So Stephanie, I will throw it back to you so that you can open up our panel with our first question.
Excellent. Thanks, Anna. So to our panelists, maybe we'll start with you, Rebecca. Can you tell us, what was it like for you growing up in a Latino family? Was faith and spirituality a part of that? And what was that like for you?
Thank you for the question. I growing up here in South Bend, Indiana, it was a transitional community in that the Latino community was just starting to move into the city. And so where I grew up on the west side of South Bend, Indiana, which in essence in its establishment is immigrant, but it was immigrant in Polish, Irish, German community. And the Latino community had been a part of South Bend, Indiana, but in the outskirts, in the campos, they were the farm workers. And so me growing up was really that first generation growing up in the city of South Bend. And so we grew up in a predominantly Polish neighborhood. We went to mass in a Hungarian German parish, St. Stephen's, and it was where my family had been migrated there. My parents grew up, planting and all, and working in the fields, and they were migrated to different parishes until we kind of were accepted at St. Stephen's with this German and Hungarian community. And so we were there 30 years, and then we are now at St. Adalbert's, which is a Polish community. And we've been there now 17 years. And so that's a little bit in regards to kind of my background growing up Latina in a growing Latino community. And it kind of just really grew even more in the 90s when we had an influx of predominantly Mexican that came for the work in the industry, not in South Bend, but in surrounding counties, but they lived in South Bend. And so that's how our community just has grown. It's predominantly with heritage of Mexican, and our parish is the same. In that regards, we are trilingual because we still do masses in Polish, English, and Spanish on special occasions. And my background in my spirituality and my faith expression really was because of my parents. And the cultural aspect of it, and wanting to hold on to, like, even just the language of Spanish. I would say fourth, fifth generation on my mom's side. My mom always says she was born in Texas, but her family was in Mexico when Texas was part of Mexico, so the border crossed them. My dad's family is from Mexico, and so that having these to where I had my grandparents growing up in our home or very close to us, so we had to speak Spanish. They didn't speak English, so Spanish was very, wanted in our home. I didn't learn English till I started school, and so we were at Spanish Mass, and it was Holy Cross congregation that offered that to us. So I grew up with Spanish Mass, and it was heavily cultural in regards to expression. And in those things like the celebrations of Virgen de Guadalupe, las posadas, Dia de los Muertos, all of that, and just a really strong cultural emphasis in our celebration of our faith.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm wondering if Leo, moving during kind of like those formative years of your life, can you tell us a little bit about how faith and spirituality were a part of your journey growing up?
Sure. So as I mentioned, I grew up in El Salvador in a war, so we didn't have clergy or priests coming to say mass. Maybe every 3 months one would come by. So whatever spiritual formation happened not with the clergy. It happened among families. It happened with the abuelas, with the elders, and that was just part of the reality. When we migrated to the U.S., since I was kind of my teenage years undocumented, I was pretty upset with. So I grew up Roman Catholic, and maybe position myself. That's the tradition that I speak out of. And I wrestled a lot with God. I was pretty angry, I would say. So my teenage years were really formative for I was having the I'm not sure what word to use, but chutzpah maybe to really wrestle with God at times very directly and with lots of accusation. I mean, I think that was really healthy for me during those years to say why I'm here in this country, I can't work, what's going to happen after I finish my high school, I have to live in the shadows in many ways. And it is out of that reality that in a way I stumbled into theological questions or spiritual questions. My mom cleans houses to this day in Los Angeles, and her boss saw that I did well in school, sent me to a private Catholic school, and that was my first contact with like formal theology or religion classes. And that's when I kind of said to myself, well, if you're going to be part of this tradition, and it's okay if you don't want to be, I mean, for myself, it's like, that's absolutely fine. But if you are going to say that you're part of this, you should probably learn more about it or commit to some practices that, make you feel like, okay, this is part of my identity. So it was years where I think I allowed myself to explore this a little deeply, eventually, actually pursuing this. And now I teach theology, among other things. So I would say I come from the margins of the church, and that's very much still out of where I operate theologically. I'll stop there for now. Thanks.
Excellent. Well, and I thank you, Leo. I can't help but note that you mentioned there was a struggle with God and a struggle with the questions about God in your teenage years. And I think that's something that we'll definitely look to explore more with our following questions. So thank you for voicing that. Before I throw it over to Anna to start with our next question, I do want to give Marisali a chance to voice in. Marisali, anything to add to this conversation about what it was like to grow up Latina and how faith and spirituality was a part of that in your experience?
Sure. So in my household, the women, or at least especially my mother's side, the women were the pillars of faith. And so my mother got it from my grandmother, and in my household, I'm the one that sort of anchored onto it. My dad and his family are more, I guess you would say, traditionally Catholic, but not so much into knowing their faith fully or engaging fully in a relationship with God, other than I would say, not so much in the personal sense, right? So there's a God and there's him and there's me. And so we have this kind of quasi, you exist, I exist, and we talk every once in a while, but not really an engagement of friendship, not really seeking, not really looking for. So in my household, it's like, we're Puerto Rican and loud. So, church was loud and it was very animated. And so us as personalities in my house, so my mom wanted to be in theater. So if that gives you any picture whatsoever. So, a lot of dynamism. So between who we were, and that's kind of how we related in terms of faith. I mean, the idea that it's dynamic, the idea that it is engaging, the idea that it's not stoic, right? And so when we came to this country, there was obviously like a bit of a shift. And I grew in terms of myself and my faith, maybe more internally, simply because when we moved to Tampa, it wasn't like we moved first to Tampa, Florida, and it's not like it is now. When we moved, where you have, Spanish, everything, every corner, it was a lot more Anglo. And so I remember that's where I did my confirmation, the Sacrament of Confirmation. I don't remember much of anything because I really didn't understand fully what was being said. I remember that for us, it was a bit of a struggle in terms of faith because we weren't able to express or to be, again, in that cultural context. There were no Spanish masses. And so for us, it became kind of a struggle. Like, we went because we knew that was what we should do. But in terms of participating, engaging, that wasn't really the thing. So a year later, we moved to Kissimmee, which most people know because it's next to Orlando and because of Disney World. And so we moved there, and there was a big influx at the time of people from Puerto Rico moving to where we were. And the reason was because the community was new and they were advertising and promoting in Puerto Rico. So you had a lot of Puerto Ricans coming in. So at that point, when we moved and kind of went back to church, we would always go to Spanish Mass. So just recently, my young adulthood, let's say late young adulthood, it's when we actually, my husband and I started going to like masses in English and having and engaging in that way, because everything was always in Spanish. So even though we spoke in English and expressed in English in many ways, the roots really of faith were all in Spanish. And so even though it doesn't seem like there would be a difference if we attended something in English, even now to this day, it's still, there seems to be like, there's a difference in the way that we express and that we live that out. And so at least for me, it was very much ingrained into who we were and the way that we celebrated our faith, the way that we engaged with our faith, whether it was at home, the traditions at home, or whether it was in like the way we attended and participated in Mass. All those things really kind of, there wasn't really like a separation. That was just kind of part of all of who we were. So yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
I think I share similar experience of almost like English as my first language, but then everything that we did was in Spanish when I was growing up, and we would go, to church or wherever my mom, who's very much part of the community, would take us. So I definitely hear what you're saying. It was always very loud, and the music was always vibrant, and anytime we would go to an English mass, it was just very different. But I think, to kind of move us into, you kind of all alluded a little bit to maybe some internal struggles or some external conflicts that you had while you rooted, your spirituality. And I think I would love to know, if you can share anything a little bit more about that, kind of like how you overcame it, and what would you say to, the students who on the survey let us know that they are struggling and they do see a difference between how they want to express themselves versus how potentially our culture or their culture and their families expect them to express themselves. So Leo, will actually start with you.
All right. So I mentioned already that struggled, fight, it was a better word, with God, cuss God out. I was very frustrated and angry, and rightfully so, I would say. This is the time when you have to make sense of your reality, whatever that may be, your sufferings, whatever those may be. And I think I found myself rather, I would say, on the one hand, empowered to feel free, or liberated to feel free to have those kinds of conversations, because there was a lot of passion in them. And then later on, also, it allowed me to have a certain humility about the whole thing, especially when my mom and I were finally able to get our papers in this country. It allowed me to have a certain peace and a certain surrender to some things working out, but things don't always work out, and we have to make sense of that also. And what do we do then? I teach students here. Let me just think about the students that I teach, and so many of my students either come from rather rigid traditions, and they're trapped. I would say many are trapped in the traditions they've inherited, and they have notions of an angry God that will punish them if certain things aren't done. Much of what I do is actually try to liberate my students into having them rethink who they think God is. And then my atheist students, or my agnostic students, or the nuns, invite them into the possibility that what they think God is from the other perspective may be something else than what kind of they've constructed it as. So from both ends, I try to kind of crack open either the rejection of or the submission to, in a way that sometimes is not healthy, so that actually there can be a free encounter. Faith that is not free is not, I would say, healthy. And so part of my job with students, and I would say this kind of based on my experience and working with students, is helping them come to a free place where they may have an encounter of holiness, their own participation in the good, but in a way that's really life-giving, and that it doesn't feel like they're constantly walking on eggshells. Because I don't think that's sustainable for one's whole life, and I don't think that's what God seeks for any of us. So I'll end there for now.
I would love to know, before we move on to Becky, how do you challenge some of the students who are not necessarily familiar with, what you're teaching?
Well, most of them aren't familiar with it, so they're first-year students. I don't know how things are there, but here they have to take a theology course. They have to, and so all of the texts that we read are theological. But I select authors that I think are great theologians. Let's say Elizabeth Johnson, for example, that write theology in a way that's inviting. And so actually, our first unit out of 4, it's all questioning or deconstructing this category or this thing we call God. Because there's a lot pushed in there. There's colonial stuff, there's patriarchal stuff, there's power dynamics, and we almost have to just break that category. And I always use God, not He. I invite them to use mystery, meaning of life, the universe, ultimate existence. So I want to invite them into own these terms and play with them. I really don't think God minds. So I want them, this is part of, I think, getting them to converse and actually begin an encounter with mystery. So I'll end there.
Amazing. Thank you, Leo, for sharing. Becky, same questions.
Well, I think in regards to being able to enter into that faith walk and talk with my students has been kind of taking on what my parents allowed me to do, and remembering that. my dad allowed me to question. You know, a lot of parents don't do that, you know. He allowed me to question, and he didn't have the answers, and he didn't pretend to have the answers, my mom and my dad. And so they led me to people to talk to. And so as I came to university myself, I remember when my dad left me at university at St. Mary's, and he said, Mija, you know, we're leaving you here, and we're trusting totally in God in all, you know, that you're going to receive. But first and foremost, I want you to remember where you come from, what you have, your morals, your values, and everything that you hold. Keep the good, you know, change the bad, you know. And so so that, taking that in regards to what my dad specifically said to me, and with my mom standing next to him, and really translating that into my relationship with my students at the University of Notre Dame. There, I work with a diverse group of students. I'm under the outreach. It's multicultural and interfaith and international. So those three segments are under outreach. And so in my multicultural, I have my Latino students that I work with. And that's one of the, in my Black students and my Asian students, is that's what I offer to them inside of their faith walk, is to really first to grasp on and to know who they are and where they come from, what was given to them. And so I really love challenging them in this way, and to enter into remembering who they are, you know, and to grasp on and to bring into memory, not just of recall, but bringing to heart, because that's real remembering. And we start that with like a first year retreat when they come onto campus. And it's cultural, and they really enter into the community and get to know the community, all the Latinos on campus, you know, and that question of who am I, you know, which is a question that Jesus asked, you know, to his disciples of himself. Who do they say I am? You know, and so, but who do you say you are? And then let's reflect on who God says, you know, that you're called to be, and who you are in that you're his child, that you're loved, that you're called, that you're all these things, you know, and it goes through formation as they're there on campus. But I think my challenge to them, and my living and walking with them, has come from my way that I was challenged by my parents, and how I was given permission to question, you know, and inside of that questioning, also knowing that it's okay not to have all the answers. It's okay that I don't live out my faith, you know, in a perfect way, and that there's not one way to do it, that there's many ways, and that God embraces all these ways, and that it's about a relationship that we're called to.
I think it's really beautiful that you're challenging your students and giving them that same freedom that your parents gave to you. And I think I want to highlight something very important that you said, that there is no one way. And I think oftentimes potentially we forget that, thinking that, you know, we have to do it the way our parents did it, or the way, you know, our community does it. But you're absolutely right. And for, you know, our three panelists, and you, Stephanie, if you have the opportunity, I very much encourage you to look at our chat box. We have some students that have been sharing their own stories and what spirituality means to them. And I think that all the responses that we're getting are incredibly beautiful, and they're very insightful. And I just want to say thank you to the students who are sharing their own journeys and their own versions in the chat box. But, you know, Marisali, you know, round us out. What do you think of this question and in your experience?
Sure. So for me, part of the struggle, especially as I grew from, you know, because when we're children, you know, my faith life is attached very much, actually webbed with the faith life of my family. And so the way that I experience and engage with God, it's totally linked and ingrained with the way that my family does it, right? And that's just kind of part also of human development, right? When we're kids, that's how we learn, right? We observe those around us and we kind of imitate them, right? That's how we get language, that's how we get accents and all these different things, which is always amazing to me. But as we grow into, now we become teens and we kind of start to figure out, okay, that question of, I'm articulating in my mind the way that I see the world, right? Now I no longer want to see it the way my parents see it. I'm kind of getting in my own brain, how does this look? And we start to really look at what all these different facets of what we do and why we do them, right? And so I think for me, the fact that I went into ministry when I was like, my mom started a youth group because I'm the oldest of three. She's like, I have a teenage daughter. There's no youth group. We need a youth group, right? So one of those like panic moments for parents. And so she started a youth group at a parish. And so for me, just kind of clicked right on. And even though I will say my relationship with Christ wasn't like an immediate, like, yes, I'm latching on, but there was something good. Like I recognized there was something good. I recognized that, I have friends from that time. We're still friends, and the opportunities that I received, I went to 2 World Youth Days. We were at rallies. We met people from all over the state of Florida and the Southeast of the United States. So all these opportunities of friendship and fun and community and celebration, again, it was just, and the idea of being free to be myself and at least exploring what did that look like, right? As I'm growing, I'm kind of learning, who am I and what does it look like to be me, right? And so I think part of the struggle with especially, well, let me continue on in this direction. And so as I grow into young adulthood, get married, obviously my husband has, kind of his own way of relating to God as well. And so in marriage, I always say there's kind of 3 different spiritualities. There's mine, there's my spouse's, and then there's the marriage's spirituality. That's kind of a combination of the both, right? And so as I continue on this question and this journey of trying to see, and especially entering then more into ministry, where I'm ministering not just to Hispanic young people, but I'm also entering into communities of young adults that is more of an in an Anglo community, and where we enter into this retreat. I remember the first time we went into a weekend retreat, my husband and I, and we were like one of 4 Hispanics out of amongst like 60 some young adults. And we kind of did feel like we have this expression in Puerto Rico, like una cucaracha en baile de gallina. So like a little roach in the chicken dance, right? Because we were like, it felt so strange and it felt so different. But at the same time, it gave us, and I think in my sense personally, permission to kind of see that my relationship to my faith did not have to look like the relationship of my parents or my family or my culture with my faith, right? We were able to see, and I say we because my husband and I are like attached to the hip or at the ring, whatever. So this idea that I'm experiencing the faith more through the lens of an angle of a different culture. And that actually gave us permission to say, well, I don't have to, I love adoration in silence. There doesn't always have to be something going on, which traditionally in a Hispanic culture, that tends to be the case, right? We always have to fill in things. And so we were able to find ourselves in a different lens through which we could see and experience faith. And that gave us permission in that sense. I also feel that part of the struggle becomes really embedded in my identity or our identity. The fact that if I let go of this tradition, if I don't express my relationship with God, which is what the word religion is, right? It's relationship. So if I don't express my relationship in this way, does that make me less Hispanic? Does that make me less Puerto Rican? Does that mean that Marisali is somehow is more Anglo than this or more this than that? And so, and I think for us, especially when we, and I think this is true for anyone who is born in one culture or raised in one culture and all of a sudden finds themselves living it out somewhere else in a different culture, is that struggle of do I become less of this and more of that if I go through anyway? And I think that's part of the tension that comes with, do I have then, how do I give myself and how do I allow myself the permission to say, it doesn't have to look like either one of those in order for it to be really me. And so in my relationship with God, these were the different experiences, and that ability to be able to say, it doesn't have to look this way. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love posadas, and I love all the, I love the Misa de Gallo, the midnight mass for Christmas with the very Puerto Rican traditional like drums and like all that kind of music. But there's something beautiful, again, to be able to say, yeah, I experience God in that way. It connects me with my Hispanic roots. It connects me with my Puerto Rican self. But also the fact that if I'm in adoration in silence, it does not diminish who I am in any other way, especially my identity with my culture. And I think that we have to look at that as well, the reality of like, am I also looking at faith, because it's so ingrained in my culture, as something that I battle with in terms of my identity, and feeling like, am I abandoning a sense of self if I go one way versus the other?
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think you touched on something very important, which is the identity struggle. And with this, with our scholars and through this Café con Joe series, we've tackled, identity, especially with language and just cultural norms and values of, if you grow up somewhere else, like what does that do to you? Are you less, are you considered American when you go back to your home country, but then when you're here, you're considered, Peruvian or Venezuelan or wherever you come from. So I think you touched on something extraordinarily important. And Stephanie, I'm going to throw it back to you so that you can ask a question that I think ties in pretty neatly to what Marisali just brought up.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Anna. What a setup. Yeah. And those are really beautiful reflections, Marisali. So thank you for especially that point on identity and navigating that. Am I enough here? Am I enough there? As we're growing kind of in our personal lives and our faith. And so to follow up on that, I want to bounce back to you, Marisali, to start off. In coming from a perspective of Latinidad, where that faith is a strong part of the culture, what would you say to our students to encourage them as they kind of push forward and wrestle with questions, but also attempt to make that faith their own in a way that might not exactly reflect the traditions that they're coming from?
I would say the first thing is, and the key is, you have to develop, or at least be willing to develop, your own relationship with God. And that is first and foremost, ahead of the traditions, ahead of the, we have to light the 50 candles at midnight at whatever day or for whatever feast. We have to dress in purple and, do a procession for 20 blocks, whatever that may be. But ahead of anything and everything that we might, quote unquote, do, the first thing is we have to pursue that relationship, right? And religion is nothing more than the way in which I work my relationship with my God. And so I have to seek the ways in which, how is he speaking to me personally, in who I am, in my struggle, in my hopes, in my dreams? What is he calling me to? And I think that's really where it starts, because until that relationship with God is a living and free relationship where I'm engaging with him, I'm never going to experience really freedom for anything else. And so I will always have this fight of attachment to this tradition, or attachment to this way of praying, or attachment to whatever it may be, without really seeing the reality behind my own relationship. And then we kind of start to see like what is essential, right? Like from a Catholic tradition, Mass is essential. Like I have to go to Mass. That's where I talk to him. That's where he talks to me. That's where he feeds me, etc. Is, praying 50 novenas back to back, is that essential to what Christ is calling me, or the relationship he seeks with me? Maybe not. You know what I mean? So I think we start to really make those distinctions, and be able then, and it allows us also to celebrate that which is really traditional from our culture within the faith, to celebrate it in a more free way, to see it also maybe as a celebration versus a burden. We don't see it as an obligation. We see it as part of who I am. But it really starts with my own self. And I think my encouragement would be, seek that relationship that will then, and let him tell you, right? And let him walk with you, with those that he puts around you, in terms of that freedom to be able to say, okay, this is who I am, and this is how I speak with you. This is how you speak with me. and help me navigate in that sense. But you have to start with him or you're just kind of bouncing off the walls a little bit.
Beautiful, wonderfully said. Seek that relationship. That's so important for us to take away from. Yeah, that says it very well. Thank you. Becky, anything to add?
I totally agree with what Marisali said. It's just so true in the sense of that that's where we need to start in seeking that relationship. And like I said, I was so grateful to my parents allowing me to enter into that. Even though the cultural pieces were there, the cultural pieces are those expressions of what that relationship is. Okay. And so one of the things so that I've entered, and just adding to that is, and just briefly, is that those cultural expressions at times when they're passed down generation and generation are not they're not really explained in regards to, you just do them to do them, and you do it because abuelita said, and or mom said, and you're there and they look beautiful and there's color, the music, there's things that move your heart. You just don't know why it's moving your heart. And so that I think that's where one of the things, especially at our parish and with my young adults at Notre Dame, is like, why do we celebrate this? Where does it come from? The formation pieces are really important. Why is your heart moving? When you hear this song, what is it saying? Ese anhelo de corazón, that desire of heart, that deep moving of your heart. And really entering into that, and what is it? And I think that's, inside of that, and that's where I have found that the cultural pieces are help in the formation, but it has to start with that identity in the sense of who am I and who is he with me and me with him, and in that sense to be able to enter into the cultural expressions, because if it's just cultural expressions because it was handed down to you, it just falls away in the end. And we've seen that in the transition of our Polish community here with now the Latino community building up there.
Wow, what a beautiful thing to reflect on, that in grappling with that question of identity and that primary relationship with God, that those cultural traditions are illuminated and really their meaning becomes much more rich. Wow. And in thinking about that, I think in a small way that's true even in my own case. I don't come from a Latino background, but growing up Italian American in New Jersey, there are just some things that you do and you best be doing them. But only in coming to a deeper relationship with God and understanding all of that was I able to really understand the richness of those traditions and grow closer to some members of my family. Leo, do you have any insights to add to this question?
I kind of forgot the question, but I can follow up on something that they both said, and it reminds me of a Buddhist student. So in my classes, at Fordham, we've got lots of kind of variety in terms of our classes. So say Christians who are way more conservative, most would probably be way liberal, but then we have Buddhists, we have Hindus, we have atheists, agnostics, and the list goes on. And one of my Buddhist students one day, because I do cover a little Buddhism and Islam in my classes, he came to my office angry, and he said, "Professor, I feel like I now understand more about the tradition I grew up in." I said, "Why didn't my parents teach me that? The only thing my mom taught me was to put money in front of that statue and then we would burn it." And he says, "I don't know why we did that." And he was clearly frustrated at having to go through rituals every year growing up. And I just listened and I said, perhaps your mother gave you her greatest treasure. And perhaps she gave you all that she understood that may have been given to her because your mother perhaps never had an opportunity to learn perhaps histories of doctrines or theologies and from a Buddhist perspective or religious frameworks, philosophical frameworks of Buddhism. But I said, but whatever she had, however limiting from your perspective, perhaps was a rich treasure. And that's as much as she could give you. A ritual of putting money in front of a statue without knowing exactly why. So now you're a different generation, and you can ask, and you have a privilege of being in a class, where we get to explore some of these more theoretical things. But perhaps what you need to do, instead of being angry at her for not giving you more than maybe she couldn't give you, take her out for lunch and say, Mom, tell me more about those rituals. Why did you do them? Try to understand what she understood. Because this is part of handing over traditions, and hopefully every generation it's more life-giving. So it reminded me of that, the importance of being aware that we all have our limitations in all varieties. But when it comes to something like the mystery of the divine, that's probably perhaps the greatest limitation we have is understanding. We never fully understand, and that's okay. So.
That's really beautiful insight, and giving ourselves permission to have patience and gentleness with ourselves and with others in that approach to God is so important. Thank you for that. Wow. Well, thank you for your sharing, and yeah, I have a lot going through my own mind. So Anna, do we want to open it up for questions, looking at the chat maybe? If anybody has a follow-up question or an additional question for our panelists, go ahead and drop it in.
Yeah, so we've been keeping up with the chat, and there's a lot of sharing that has definitely happened in terms of what spirituality means to students, how it's been expressed in their culture, how they grew up with it, and we've had some wonderful stories shared there. If anyone has a question, please feel free to raise your hand. But I know we pulled a question from the, oh my gosh, what did we send? The survey. I apologize. So we pulled a question from the survey, so we can dive into that one and see if we have a follow-up afterwards. So the question in the survey was, oh my gosh, I lost it.
I have it pulled up right here.
Do you have it? I'm so sorry.
I do. Yeah, absolutely. So this is a question about that cultural faith and maybe kind of the roots of where that was given to culture. So we had somebody on our survey ask, how can we, as descendants of colonized people, approach faith that was traditionally European and kind of imposed upon us in some circumstances? How can we navigate that and understand that and approach that? So I'm just going to put that out there, and whichever one of you wants to tackle that, please go ahead. It's important.
To give you also a couple seconds to think, because I feel like that was the most loaded question we had in our survey. One of the things, I don't know, Stephanie, maybe you want to talk about what we're going to do next Thursday while we give the panelists a chance to think about the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Anna. So if what has been shared here tonight has been meaningful for you, if you've enjoyed talking about faith and culture, we are going to have an opportunity to continue this discussion and explore ways that maybe we can continue to journey together or not. I know that one of our students, Amarilis, is dropping some opportunities in the chat, and as well, I'm going to put a graphic for some cafe and sweet treats that we're going to have on the green next Thursday at 4:30 p.m. So if you've enjoyed this, if you want to keep the conversation going, if you want to find opportunities to express your faith and lean into those questions of relationship, I invite you to join us.
Thank you, Stephanie. So we can go back to our question, and let's see. Becky, we will start with you.
Sorry, I was trying to get my mute button. Well, I think inside of that, I think the question, like you said, it's like really huge in the sense in regards that you can think from it theologically, but also in the sense of in regards to relationship, as we've been talking about. one of the things I remember taking a group of my students to the Basilica in Mexico City, La Virgen de Guadalupe. And one of the students I remember asking and saying, you know, this faith of colonization in regards to the indigenous peoples and how we well, he wasn't of Mexican heritage or anything, so he was coming from a different perspective in that sense also. But also in regards to the Mexican heritage in that sense, you know, the colonization that occurred in the overwhelming history that people carry because of colonization, right? That we all carry it. But one of the things I told them inside of that specific experience in regards to La Virgen de Guadalupe, when we're talking about what happened in that time, the conversion wasn't taking place during a great deal during that time. You know, that when they first arrived, when the Spanish first arrived into the community, indigenous community, it wasn't until, you know, La Virgen de Guadalupe, you know, came into the presence of this indigenous man and really allowing him to live inside of who he is, you know, and to recognize that his dignity is received, you know, that we are able to then see that it wasn't the colonization, but it was God himself that allowed us to enter into, you know, who he is. And so inside of that, I have reflected a great deal just in regards to myself and my own faith. And why am I Catholic? Why am I in this walk with Christ? And it's because of an invitation that he himself has made to me, and not because anybody has imposed anything on me. And I think that has been something in the sense that I have allowed myself to enter into, to be able to allow my, you know, my students to also enter into that and to explore that invitation, and to not to live into the oppressive parts, because it is the Holy Spirit that lives inside of that invitation. It's God. And I think for myself, I've allowed myself to do that.
Thank you for sharing, Becky. Leo?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, it's a great question. A couple of things I would say. So what we've inherited, although we can say it's a European faith, it was always a Middle Eastern faith before that. And a couple of things that I remind my students of: let us remember that Jesus was born in the midst of empire, Roman Empire, that he was not a Roman citizen like Paul, so he could not appeal to the emperor or to the state for protection of any kind like Paul could. Not to put Paul or Jesus against each other, but I'm just saying Jesus did not have some privileges that others in the early church may have had. It is a Middle Eastern movement, yes, filtered through Europe, and that's how it's reached us. But maybe I'm going to answer more directly the question is by talking about slavery. So West Africans are taken and enchained and brought to the U.S., you know, and to the Americas, and then eventually the U.S. and slave trade here. And Christianity, of course, is imposed by their white masters. And yet, I just taught this last week with my students, so it's fresh. And yet, we have something like the slave spirituals that come out of this, these songs that are rich spiritual witnesses. So I think what I want to emphasize is, for all of us that in one way or another live within colonized structures, a church that still is yet to reckon with its own history and participation in colonization. How do we turn what we have inherited, the faith we've inherited, and make it into a source of freedom, both internal, our freedom, but then the freedom of also our neighbor? We haven't focused, I think, on kind of the neighbor and the faith. So some would argue that there is no love of God that does not go through the love of neighbor. So if we're talking about colonization, we have to talk about power dynamics and the other, those at the margins. How do we take what we've inherited? It is what it is. And so and use it for life, for our life, and then the life of others who are at the many margins, not only of the church, but many other margins that are death dealing. Yeah, I'll stop with that.
That is such an interesting shift in thought, and such an interesting way to kind of like repose the question. I'm sure I can see Stephanie thinking in her tile. But Marisali, do you have anything to add upon that?
Sure. I'm almost piggybacking on both. The idea that, if people of faith, we tend to believe and see that God brings good out of everything, right? And he will fulfill his purpose out of everything, out of any situation, as tragic as it might be, right? That there is some glory that he's always going to bring about. And so at the same time, I'm, kind of following Leo in the sense that I see it as how, and a little bit also on Becky's, like, how have I received this invitation? And whom would I be without it? Whom would I have been if it had never gotten to me, in this line? And then now that it is with me, what am I called to do with it? So I think, for me, sometimes it's that fight against, can I use the memory of the past as an excuse for my own victimization? Or do I use the history of the past to truly, which is supposed to be the reason we study history, so that I can draw what was good, I can draw what can be built upon and actually built, versus keeping it as a yoke to keep myself down, to keep others down. And I think, again, how was I invited, right? If I'm looking at my life truly guided by this God who thought of me and knew me and knows me better than I know myself, and how this journey from my mother's womb until now, how he has allowed for all the dynamics, not just from that moment, but from all the way in the past, in the beginning of history, to bring about, in a way, to bring about who I am now. And in a sense, for him to continue that history, to bring about whoever might be, 1,000 years down the line, or whatever it might be. But the fact that when we talk about, we stand on the shoulders of those before us, that it's not just the shoulders of those that built, but unfortunately sometimes in the ones that destroyed, in a sense. But that doesn't mean that out of ashes, beauty doesn't come. And so I think that we really, to be able to see our history as part of, and as tragic as it might be, in some senses, there's a lot of blessings that have come about. And at the same time, I have to say that I am who I am because not just of those that came before me that I knew, but those that came way before me that I've never met. And so, and I think that's important to remember. And what do I do with that moving forward? I think is the greatest gift that we could have received from the past, regardless of what that past may be.
I think the three of you have been so incredibly insightful, and have such different but yet same perspectives. Like there's so much commonality among you, yet you have all these different experiences and all these different roles across the country. And I just want to say thank you so much for your time, and for really emphasizing how you can still struggle with your spirituality and find your ground and find it and make it your own, and question and have the freedom to explore that relationship. And I think that I hope that definitely resonated with our audience, especially, given the results of our survey. And Stephanie, do you want to add anything, before we close off?
Yeah, again, I just want to thank our panelists, even just in that last question, for making room for many sides of the same issue, right? And teaching us and showing us how all can be held in a unity when we place that faith relationship with God as kind of that preeminent one. And so I just want to thank you for your insights and for the depth of your perspectives. And I think it's so important to talk about faith from that depth, and in that depth here in a collegiate community where we are exploring depth in so many other ways. So just thank you for being here.
And thank you so much for everyone who shared their own stories. and who, you know, gave us the opportunity to read through some of the stories. I know I saw some questions about campus ministry in some groups, but again, one of the things that Stephanie and I also hope to do through this collaboration is help students find spiritual communities on campus. So if you want to keep this conversation going, if you want to, you know, explore different depths like Stephanie mentioned, you know, join us next Thursday at 4:30 on the green, and we'll send out some more information for that. And to our panelists, you're also invited to join us on the green if you can make it to our green. But you know, we'll send out more information. And again, like, thank you so much for everything. And we hope you found this session truly, truly valuable. Have a good night, everybody.